Have you ever wondered why some people stay stuck in the exact same place for years, even when they desperately want to change? Why do some of us feel like we're running in circles, moving but never moving forward? And here's the real question. What if it's not your fault at all, but simply the way your brain tries to protect you? Today, we're going to uncover a surprising truth about why people stay stuck, and why breaking free feels so hard even when you know what you want. Subscribe to the channel to learn even more about how your mind shapes your life, and how understanding it can unlock your future. Feeling stuck is one of the most common human experiences, yet very few people can clearly explain why it happens. We all know someone who has dreams, plans, hopes, but somehow they never move forward. And sometimes, that someone is us. Maybe it's a project we've been postponing for years, or a decision we're afraid to make, or a goal we secretly hope to reach, but keep avoiding. It's strange, isn't it? Why would anyone avoid something they actually want? The truth is that being stuck doesn't come from laziness, weakness, or lack of ambition. It comes from something much deeper, from the way our brain learned to keep us safe. When we were younger, our mind carefully observed the world around us. It learned what was dangerous, what was safe, what caused stress, and what brought comfort. And sometimes, without us realizing it, the brain built walls meant to protect us, but those same walls can end up trapping us in place. Researchers in psychology often talk about a concept called learned helplessness, discovered by Martin Seligman. It describes what happens when a person experiences situations where their actions don't change anything. With time, the brain concludes, there's no point trying. Even if circumstances change, even if opportunities appear, the person still feels stuck because their brain expects failure before they even begin. It's like trying to drive a car with the brakes pressed down. No matter how hard you push the gas, you're not going anywhere. But there's another side to this story too. Our brain loves what is familiar. Familiar things feel safe, predictable, and comfortable, even when they're not good for us. That's why staying in the same routine, the same habits, the same fears, or even the same problems can feel easier than stepping into the unknown. The mind whispers, better the devil you know. And so we stay. Not because we want to, but because we feel stuck between fear and comfort. In this video, we will explore how these invisible forces shape our choices, our emotions, and even the paths we take in life. We will look at real psychological mechanisms, simple stories from everyday life, and surprisingly clear explanations that show how the brain can quietly hold us back, and how, once you understand what's happening, you can finally take your first honest step forward. Have you ever noticed how people often describe being stuck as if it were a physical space? They say things like, I feel trapped, I can't get out of this place, I'm going in circles, or I'm stuck in the same spot. It's interesting, because they're not talking about an actual location, they're describing a mental state. But the reason this language feels so natural is because the brain truly treats psychological barriers like physical ones. To your mind, fear, uncertainty, and bad past experiences can feel as real as a locked door. Let's start with something fundamental. Your brain is not designed to make you happy, it's designed to keep you alive. That's why safety always comes before progress. So when you think about taking a big step, starting a new job, moving to a new place, learning a new skill, confessing your feelings, or changing your routine, your brain immediately begins scanning for danger. And if something feels uncertain, the brain turns on a protective system that psychologists call the threat response. You know this feeling even if you don't think about it. A tight stomach, a little pressure in your chest, a voice in your head saying, wait, what if something goes wrong? The problem is that your brain can't distinguish between a real threat, like a wild animal chasing you, and a modern, emotional one, like applying for a position you think you're not good enough for. Thousands of years ago, fear kept us alive. Today, the same fear keeps us stuck. Imagine a student who wants to raise their hand in class, but is terrified of giving the wrong answer. Their brain reacts as if a mistake could lead to danger, even though the worst thing that will happen is a little embarrassment. Or think about someone who wants to start a YouTube channel but finds themselves overthinking every detail: the lighting, the voice, the comments they might receive. These fears aren't logical, but they feel powerful because the brain treats unfamiliar situations as risky. Another powerful force is habit loops. Automatic patterns the brain creates to save energy. Once a behavior becomes familiar, your brain prefers sticking to it because it feels comfortable. That's why people often fall back into old habits, even when they genuinely want to change. It's not because they don't care, it's because their brain says, we already know how to survive like this. Let's not risk something new. In fact, a 2018 study by researchers at MIT found that habit patterns are stored in a part of the brain called the basal ganglia, the same region that controls movement. This means your brain literally remembers routines the same way it remembers how to walk. Breaking a habit is like learning to walk a completely different way. Let's take an example from daily life. Imagine someone who dreams of waking up early, exercising, eating healthier, or reading more. They feel inspired at night, but when the morning comes, they hit the snooze button. Not because they're weak, but because their brain is following a familiar pattern. It's like a road that has already been carved through a forest. Going down that path feels easier than forcing your way through the trees to create a new one. And then there's social pressure, a subtle but powerful invisible force that shapes our thoughts without us even noticing. We might want to change careers, move to another city, or choose a different lifestyle, but we stop ourselves because we fear judgment. We fear disappointing others. We fear being the strange one. Throughout human history, belonging to the group meant survival. So even today, disagreeing with people, or doing something unusual can trigger the same fear our ancestors felt when they risked being left out of their tribe. The fear is ancient, but the world around us has changed, and the brain hasn't caught up yet. There's also something psychologists call identity loops, when a person believes something about themselves so strongly that the belief becomes a cage. For example, someone who has always heard you're shy, you're not good at math, you're irresponsible, or you're not creative, may accept these labels as part of who they are. Over time, the brain builds a self-image based on these messages, and stepping outside that identity feels threatening. The person might not even try new things because the brain says, that's not who we are. So when someone feels stuck, in a job, a relationship, a habit, or a mindset, it's rarely because of laziness. More often, it's because their brain is running old programs that were meant to protect them, not help them grow. And the most interesting part is that these programs often originate from childhood, from the environment we grew up in, the reactions of adults around us, the examples we watched, even the small comments we heard over and over again. Modern neuroscience shows that the brain is constantly changing, a phenomenon called neuroplasticity. This means that even if your mind has built walls around you, those walls are not permanent. They can be changed, rewritten, restructured. But to do that, you first need to understand why they're there. And that's exactly what we're uncovering today. Now let's look even deeper at the mechanics behind being stuck, because understanding these invisible forces is the first step to breaking free from them. One of the most surprising truths modern psychology teaches us is this: your brain loves predictability more than it loves progress. This explains why people so often stay in situations that make them unhappy, toxic friendships, boring routines, unhealthy habits, or even environments that limit their growth. To the brain, familiar discomfort is often more acceptable than unfamiliar possibility. Take, for example, someone who dreams of switching careers. They imagine something more exciting, something meaningful, something they would truly enjoy. But instead of taking action, they stay in the same job, year after year, telling themselves that the timing isn't right, or maybe next month. But beneath these excuses lies a simple neurological fact. The brain is wired to avoid uncertainty, even at the cost of long-term satisfaction. A study from University College London showed that uncertainty alone activates the brain's pain centers, meaning that not knowing what will happen next can physically feel uncomfortable, almost like a real threat. This explains why so many people remain in familiar patterns. The brain prefers a predictable routine because it knows how to manage it. The unknown, even if it's positive, triggers resistance. And this resistance can be incredibly subtle. It doesn't always look like fear. Sometimes it looks like procrastination. Sometimes it looks like overthinking. Sometimes it looks like starting something with enthusiasm, and then quietly giving up halfway through. From the outside, it seems irrational. But from the brain's perspective, it's perfectly logical. Protect the system by avoiding uncertain outcomes. Let's consider another everyday example: relationships. Many people stay in friendships or partnerships that drain them, not because they want to, but because their brain has become attached to the familiar emotional pattern. If you spend years feeling a certain way, stressed, anxious, overly responsible, or undervalued, the brain begins to treat these feelings as normal. So when peace or happiness finally appears, it can feel almost uncomfortable or suspicious. Some people even sabotage good things without realizing why. Their brain is simply returning them to the emotional climate it knows best. There's also something called the comfort-danger paradox. Humans are drawn to comfort because it saves energy and reduces stress. But too much comfort begins to feel like stagnation. Imagine living in a room that's soft, warm, and safe, but has no doors or windows. At first it feels pleasant. Then eventually it becomes suffocating. That's exactly what happens when we remain in the same habits for too long. The brain stops receiving new stimulation. And without new experiences, even positive ones, personal growth slows to a halt. Neuroscientists like Dr. Michael Merzenich have shown that the brain only continues developing when it is regularly challenged by new tasks, environments, and learning. Without this, the brain quite literally becomes rigid, repeating the same patterns simply because they are familiar. And here's the tricky part. Being stuck doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it feels like a quiet routine, a predictable day, a sense that nothing is really wrong, but nothing is truly right either. Psychologists call this state stagnation, and it's one of the most dangerous places a person can remain because it slowly shapes their identity. 1 year of stagnation feels tolerable. 5 years begins to feel normal. 10 years becomes a story you tell yourself. This is just the person I am. But in reality, it's not personality, it's momentum. It's simply the continuation of old neural pathways. To break these cycles, researchers say the first step is awareness. When you catch yourself repeating the same fears, the same excuses, the same emotional patterns, this is the moment you can begin to create change. But awareness alone isn't enough. The second step is small exposure to the unknown. Instead of trying to transform your entire life in one leap, the brain learns best through gradual challenges. A new route to school, a new hobby, a conversation with someone new, a tiny risk that sends the message: we can survive new experiences. Each small step rewires the brain, slowly making change feel safer. And this brings us to a beautiful truth. Your brain is not a prison. It is a landscape you can reshape. Each new experience is like carving a fresh path through the forest. At first it's uncomfortable, messy, and unfamiliar. But with each repeated step, the path becomes clearer, easier, and eventually natural. The old paths, the ones that kept you stuck, begin to fade. This is neuroplasticity in action, not as a scientific theory, but as something you can feel in your daily life. But to fully understand how people become stuck, and how they break free, we need to explore one more hidden force. And this force is so deeply rooted in human history that it affects nearly every decision we make today. To truly understand why people get stuck, and why escaping that feeling is so incredibly difficult, we need to talk about one of the oldest forces guiding human behavior: fear of social disapproval, also known as fear of judgment. This fear is much older than modern society. It comes from a time when humans lived in small tribes, where being accepted could mean the difference between survival and danger. If the group rejected you, you didn't just feel embarrassed, you risked losing protection, food, and safety. Even though the world around us has changed dramatically, this ancient fear still lives deep inside the brain. Scientists have shown that when people feel judged or rejected, the brain activates the same regions that process physical pain. In other words, being judged hurts the same way as being physically injured. This explains why people hesitate to try new things in front of others. It explains why someone might want to post their art online, or share an idea in class, or start a business, but then stop because of an imaginary audience in their mind saying, "What if they laugh? What if they think I'm stupid? What if I fail publicly?" Let's imagine a simple situation. A person wants to start learning dance. They imagine how fun it could be, how good it must feel, how freeing it is to move with the music. But then they picture walking into a dance studio for the first time. The room goes quiet. Everyone looks at them. In their mind, they see every flaw in their posture, every mistake they might make, and suddenly the dream feels impossible. The logical part of the mind says, there's no real danger. But the emotional part, the older part of the brain, screams, avoid this. Not because the person is incapable, but because the brain overestimates social danger. This happens in school too. Students who know the right answer stay silent because they fear looking foolish. Teens avoid joining clubs or trying sports because they fear being the newbie. Adults avoid asking questions at work because they fear sounding unprepared. Our brains still treat social embarrassment like a threat to survival, even though today, it's nothing more than a passing moment. Another force that reinforces the feeling of being stuck is narrative identity, the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. It forms quietly, through experiences, comments from others, and conclusions we come to when we're young. If someone grows up hearing, you're not athletic, you're too emotional, you're not smart, or even you're average, these words become part of the internal story. And once a story takes root, the brain begins to filter everything through that lens. Imagine a child who once froze during a presentation. The class laughed, the teacher rushed to help, and the child felt overwhelmed. Years later, even as a teenager, that memory still shapes how they see themselves. They might say, I'm just bad at speaking. They believe it not because it's true, but because the memory was emotional enough for the brain to store as a warning. So every time they face a new speaking situation, the old memory wakes up and says, remember what happened last time? And this is how a single event can shape years of life. Math works the same way. Many students aren't bad at math. They simply had one confusing lesson, one discouraging teacher, or one test they failed early on. Their brain then decided, this is not our territory. And from that moment, every new challenge feels like a threat rather than a skill to learn. The fascinating part? Studies show the human brain is naturally good at pattern recognition, the core of math. But because of fear, people close the door before they even try. Let's look at an adult example. Someone who wants to travel alone, but keeps postponing it. They tell themselves they're not the type, or they're too anxious, or they wouldn't manage. But that's the story, not the truth. The truth is that traveling alone is unfamiliar, and the brain mistakes unfamiliarity for danger. When faced with the unknown, the mind often prefers to stay where it is. Now combine all these forces: the fear of uncertainty, the fear of failure, the fear of judgment, the comfort of old habits, and the stories we tell ourselves. They stack together like layers of armor. Armor meant to protect us, but that ends up trapping us. This is why being stuck can feel so heavy and unchangeable. It isn't just one thing. It's dozens of internal mechanisms working at the same time. But here's the key: the brain is not fixed. It is adaptable, flexible, and constantly changing. Every new experience, even a small one, begins to reshape how the brain evaluates risk and possibility. Every time you do something slightly uncomfortable but not dangerous, your brain learns that the world is safer than it thought. Each small success rewrites your identity a little. Each tiny step weakens the old narrative. The reason many people stay stuck isn't because they can't change. It's because they don't realize that change can start with something as small as trying a new task, having one honest conversation with themselves, or taking one uncomfortable step. And that brings us to one final, powerful question. If the brain can adapt, then what exactly keeps people from making that first move? And the answer is simpler and more hopeful than it seems. Most people wait for the feeling of confidence before they act. They think, once I'm ready, I'll start. Or once I stop being scared, I'll try. But confidence doesn't come before action. It comes from action. The brain can only update its beliefs by seeing new evidence. And that evidence appears after we do something, not before. So the real barrier isn't fear, and it isn't lack of ability. It's the belief that we must feel different before we begin. That belief freezes people in place. They wait for perfect conditions, for clarity, for motivation, for the fear to magically fade. But none of that arrives on its own. The truth is, the first step is supposed to feel uncomfortable. It's supposed to feel uncertain. That discomfort isn't a sign that you're incapable. It's a sign that you're growing. Think about it. Every important moment in life, from your first day in school to your first new skill, felt unfamiliar. Yet each of those moments reshaped you. Children don't wait to feel confident before taking their first steps. They wobble, fall, get up, and try again. And that is how confidence is built. Adults forget this, but the brain doesn't. It still learns the same way, through tiny, repeated attempts. So if you've been feeling stuck, here is the gentle truth. You don't need a giant breakthrough. You don't need a perfect plan. You don't need to erase fear. You don't need to reinvent yourself overnight. You just need one small, honest action. Something so simple your brain can't argue with it. A step that proves, I can move. Because once the brain sees movement, even tiny movement, it begins to rewrite the old story. You start realizing that judgment won't break you. Failure won't destroy you. Uncertainty won't swallow you. Instead, these things slowly become familiar. And once they're familiar, they stop being frightening. So ask yourself, what is the smallest step you can take? Today, not someday. That would show your brain a new possibility. Maybe it's raising your hand once. Maybe it's sharing one idea. Maybe it's learning for 5 minutes. Maybe it's signing up, showing up, or simply trying again. The moment you take that step, no matter how tiny, something shifts. You begin to prove to yourself that change is not a huge wall. It's a series of small doors. And every time you open one, the next door becomes easier. So if you've been waiting for permission, for confidence, for the perfect moment, this is it. Not because everything is suddenly easy, but because now you understand why it's hard, and why that difficulty is not a barrier, but a beginning. You're not stuck. Your story is not finished. And the smallest step forward could be the one that changes everything.